Hey, hello and welcome to the Apologetics Academy. If you are joining us for the first time, this is a weekly webinar which I run every Saturday at 8 p.m. here in the UK, which corresponds to 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Central Time, and 12 noon Pacific Time. And every week we bring on different scholars, experts, apologists, scientists, philosophers from across the theological and philosophical spectrum to present on topics of interest to Christians, particularly on topics that pertain to the question of whether or not Christianity is true. And we also cross-examine and evaluate other worldviews such as Islam, Mormonism, atheism, and so on. This is an interactive program. The way we normally do it is we have a speaker present to us, and then we open up for open floor Q&A, discussion, dialogue, debate. And there's a number of ways that you can participate in the live Q&A session. You can submit questions by hitting the Q&A button at the top of your screen, and you can enter in a question in textual form anonymously if you wish. You can also submit questions on Facebook by typing in the comments on the live video feed, which is going live on Facebook right now. You can also click the raise hand button at the top of the Zoom application, and I will promote you to be a co-panelist, and you have opportunity to interact that way as well. To give you an idea of what's coming up in the next few weeks, next Saturday, we have Dr. David Wood, who is very well known on the subject of Islam. He's from X17 Apologetics and AnsweringMuslims.com, and he's going to be giving us a presentation on the psychology of Islam. The following Saturday, on June 3rd, we have an astrophysicist from Reasons to Believe called Dr. Jeff Zwierink, who's going to be giving us a presentation on Is the Multiverse an Information Generating Machine? And then the following week, on June 10th, actually, I'm going to be giving a presentation, which is going to be on undesigned coincidences in the scriptures and argument of their veracity. So coming back to this evening, or this afternoon, depending where you are in the world, we have with us Jonathan Daugherty of Be Broken Ministries, who's going to be speaking to us on the subject of God's design for sexuality. And I think he's also going to be giving us his own testimony of God's grace in his own life, from bondage to sexual addiction to freedom and joy in Christ. So Jonathan, do you want to maybe introduce yourself for those that haven't come across you, and just launch into the topic? That would be awesome.
Sure. I was actually having a little bit of technical difficulties. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine, yeah. Can you hear me?
Okay, good. Yeah, I had to go to my headphones because I couldn't hear you, but I can hear you. It was intermittent. So, but yes, I appreciate you just for the invitation and just kind of creating this space here for us to be able to talk about something that I'm not so sure how often this topic gets talked about in what we might consider an apologetics environment. This is one of those things where a lot of times when we're talking about disciple making and defending the faith and these types of things, and upholding the word of God, a lot of times it ends up being something that gets quite a ways away from this topic of sexuality, which is a little bit interesting, because I think, if you were to put a percentage on it, you might have to say that 15 to 20% of Scripture contains some passages that have to do with the body and sexuality. So God has no problem talking about the subject. And so I'd like to share a little bit of my story, just to give your viewers and listeners an opportunity to see what God has done in my life regarding this issue of sexuality. And then I'd love to talk a little bit more about what I believe the Scriptures have to say about God's design for sexuality, and why it is important to defend this truth in the cultures in which we live today around the world. So I had the privilege of growing up in a Christian home, a home that upheld the Word of God. I had two parents that they loved the Lord Jesus, and they loved me and my sister. And even in that environment, though, one of the things that I discovered eventually was that you can live in an environment that is safe, that is loving, that is truth-telling, and it's not impenetrable by the dangers of pornography and other kinds of sexual sin. So in my case, when I was about 12 years old, I was introduced to pornography by a friend, and it was something that I was not expecting to see. So when I did see it, it was a little bit shocking because I had no point of reference for knowing how to deal with it. I had never seen pornography before, had never really had any conversations with my parents or anybody else about the issue of pornography. And so it was if I could put it so bluntly, it was a traumatic event for me. And in that trauma, I didn't share that with anybody. I mean, my friend knew about it, but I was playing along and trying to just take cues from him in terms of how I should react. But I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell a pastor. I didn't tell anybody of that experience. And that sort of planted the seed for what over the next 13 years would turn into a full-blown sexual addiction. At first, it didn't seem like anything serious. I mean, all throughout junior high and high school, I basically, if I saw pornography, I wouldn't deny it. I wouldn't resist it. And then I started searching for it. And my drugs, so to speak, throughout junior high and high school were basically this combination of pornography, fantasy, and masturbation. Those were the outlets that I would express my sexual feelings. And pornography became this world where I could feel, if I can put it in those terms. I think in my home growing up, we didn't have there wasn't a whole lot of emotional bonding. We knew how to talk to each other. We knew how to express certain things, maybe verbally, but it was more difficult to have the connection emotionally in my family. And so one thing I discovered through pornography is, man, it's an outlet for being able to really feel a lot of things. And I think sexuality, God designed our sexuality in that way to feel emotions as an expression of our sexuality. But I'll get into a little bit of that later. When I got into college, all the way up through high school, I had not crossed what we might call the flesh barrier, meaning I had not crossed into expressing my sexuality with another human being. And while I believe the underpinnings of sexual lust and the things, the foundations that are laid in pornography and the viewing and expression of sexuality through pornography have a similar foundation to what can then occur when you cross the flesh barrier and you begin to be sexual with another person, I do believe that there can be differences in the consequences and the type of bonding that can occur on, if I can put it this way, on a soul level. So when I got into college, I did cross the flesh barrier and I began to be sexual with other people. And that really just created a whole new form of dividedness in my life because, I mean, I had been keeping my porn issue a secret, and now I was keeping my live encounters a secret, and it just created this dividedness. I had to become what I call an image builder. I would project an image to people that they found acceptable or charming or intelligent or spiritual or whatever the context was. I would build an image, project that image, and then the whole while is on the inside, my flawed self is just eroding. It's just dying in this poor and lustful behaviors. And I believe the reason that dividedness is such a discomfort is because I don't believe that's actually the way God designed us to live. I believe that when we look in 1 John 1, we're told that God is light, in him there's no darkness at all, meaning there's not this deceptive, he doesn't play a bait and switch kind of thing with us where he tells us one thing and then he switches and does something else. He's not deceptive. And so to live a double life is to be deceptive. And God tells us that we're to be like him in how we live out our lives. So if there's no darkness in him, he is light, there's no darkness in him, then whenever there's darkness in us, there's this dividedness. I might present myself as somebody who is full of light and living the truth while the whole time inside I'm decaying in my darkness. I ended up meeting my wife to be when I was a junior in college, and she was a freshman. And I really thought this would solve all kinds of problems for me. I think a lot of single guys, especially single Christian men, especially, think, man, if I can just get married, it's going to solve my porn problem because I'm going to be able to have this righteous sex, whenever I want. And for a while after my wife and I got married, it did seem like, man, my problem was cured. I would say for probably 5 or 6 weeks, I was cured in the sense that I was in the honeymoon phase of marriage, and I wasn't dealing with any temptation. I mean, we were having a lot of sex and it was fun, and I wasn't feeling the weight of any kind of temptations or struggles. But then after those first 5 or 6 weeks, I woke up to the realization that any married man eventually wakes up to, and that is the realization that this person is not me. Not only is she not me, she's way different from who I am and how I think and how I process. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, just this idea of how God has made us male and female, and just down even to the chromosomal level, we're fundamentally different, even down to the cells in our bodies. And the stress of realizing that I'm not like this woman and she's not like me created those feelings again of needing to escape, needing to find relief, because that's kind of what stress does. It seeks an escape. And my old coping mechanisms had always been be sexual. That's the way you deal with your stress. And so little by little, I had these things creep back into my life, a little bit of pornography, some fantasy, some masturbation, things that at first did not seem like, oh, these are going to destroy my marriage. And I think a lot of guys live there. Like, I think a lot of guys live in this state of, I can sort of have me time, which is, hey, I go off and I do my pornography thing, I do my masturbation thing, fantasy, whatever else, and I can kind of compartmentalize that. And I kind of have my me time. And I can see that as totally separate from my marriage. And so therefore, I don't see these things as necessarily being conflicted. And I think a lot of men, even Christian men, live in that space of compartmentalizing their sexual sin in such a way that they find it, at least to themselves, manageable, meaning, hey, it's not really interrupting my life. It's not really causing any havoc in my marriage. And on the surface, that's how I felt, because I didn't see, at least on the surface, that this was necessarily impacting my marriage in a negative way. But sin doesn't operate on the surface. It operates at a much deeper level. And it was doing things to me emotionally. It was causing me to see life through a different grid. I was not seeing people as these beloved image bearers of the creator of the universe. I was seeing them as objects. I was seeing them as somebody to be used for my sexual lust and fantasy, rather than as somebody for whom Christ has died and that they've got intrinsic value being created in his image. And so that's another whole thing that pornography can do. It just totally shifts how we see people. They become a commodity. Sex becomes simply something that's mechanical for pleasure, rather than a means by which oneness is created in this covenant bond of marriage. And so all these things were happening without me realizing that this was eroding the foundation of my marriage. Eventually, I got a computer, and this was back in the day when the internet was brand new as far as being residentially accessible. And so I ended up getting me a telephone line and plugged up the dial-up internet, and I started looking at pornography online. And that got me hooked. And now I'm realizing, though, I have to keep a secret, because not just for reputation's sake, but because logistically I'm now living with another person. I'm living with my wife. And so when I was starting to look at pornography online, I'm realizing, how do I make sure that this doesn't get found out by my wife? Now, that should have clued me in that something's unhealthy here. When a husband is trying to lie to his wife, and he's trying to figure out a way to not tell the truth to his wife, that should be an indication. Red flags should be going off that says this isn't how a healthy marriage is built. But I wasn't thinking on that level. And so I actually kind of became a little bit of a a tech geek for all the wrong reasons. I mean, I was learning to cover all my tracks and everything online in order to not be found out by my wife. And then when I, well, a little while after getting the internet, probably about 6 to 9 months later, they came out with this new technology called chat. And I know I'm dating myself here, but I started getting into chat rooms then to sort of heighten the excitement of the sexual lust. And I started having these sexual conversations with other people. Eventually, as is always the case with lust, because lust is never satisfied, and it will always push you up against the lines that you said you never cross and try to get you to go over them. Eventually, one day I was in a chat room and 2 little words came across the screen, "Want to meet?" And I was being invited to cross a line that I said I would never cross, because I stood in the front of a church in front of over 400 people, declaring to them and to God and to my wife that I would be faithful to her. And in hindsight, I have realized over the years that lust, that's part of our sinful nature that still desires pleasure at all costs, did not care one bit about the commitment that I had made to my wife, about the commitment that I had made to God. And I replied to that request of "want to meet" with yes. And I went and met this person offline and had sex. And I came home from that encounter, and as I'm driving home, I'm just trembling as I'm driving in the car home and thinking of all the, just the stupidity and just all the consequences and all these kinds of things. And I'm doing what so many people do in that moment of desperation, of realizing, man, I've really blown it big time. And I was making all the promises that we tend to make in those moments. But one promise that I didn't make, that I rarely hear any man ever make in that circumstance, is the promise to tell somebody. I didn't make the promise to bring it into the light. A lot of times the promises are all things that we think we can put on our own shoulders. Hey, I'm going to get rid of the computer. I'll never do that again. I'll delete all my accounts. I'll delete all the email accounts. I. And it's keeping this very self-centered paradigm in place. And it's really out of that self-centered paradigm that all of my lustful behaviors were thriving. And so it was very foolish of me to then think, hey, I can make all these promises that rely on me and think that I'm actually going to succeed and follow through and do all these things. And so, as you can imagine, then things only got worse, because I didn't keep any of those promises. I kept the chat rooms. I kept the accounts. I eventually became a serial adulterer, where I would use the internet to set up offline encounters with women that I'd met, maybe even just that day. And eventually, when the internet wasn't the means by which I could connect with people, I even then began crossing legal boundaries and started paying for sex. I hired prostitutes. And so lust is never satisfied, and it demands you cross these lines that you never crossed before. And even if anybody out there is listening or watching and saying, well, I've never crossed the flesh barrier, I've never done anything illegal. But if you've looked at pornography, if you've been involved in pornography, I always ask the question, if you've been involved in that for a long time, are you going to admit that you're looking at exactly the same things that you started looking at? So many times, even within whatever realm of sexual sin we're dealing with, there's a progression or a digression of activity. So you can get worse and worse even within that particular area of pornography. I have never met a single man who is either in prison or facing jail time for child pornography that set out to view child pornography. It was always this progression of lust demanding more and more and more. Cross that line, you'll get away with it, nobody will know. Well, eventually in the summer of 1999, all of my spit hit the fan, so to speak, and I confessed everything to my wife. And it was not a good strategy for confession. I mean, it was just some random Tuesday night, and I just dumped it all on her. And we try to help people walk through, well, there's never an easy way to confess, and there's never a comfortable way to confess. There can be a more wise way to confess than just out of the blue, boom, just hit her with everything. But that's what I did, and I just dumped everything on her, the affairs, the masturbation, the porn, the prostitutes, all of it. And she was withering on the couch. And eventually, when I got everything out, she's in this tight fetal position, can't produce any more tears. And a strange thing happened to me, though. I felt lighter when everything was out. And it sounds cruel because obviously it all got dumped on her. But I experienced in that moment something of a biblical truth that we also see in 1 John, of that idea of when we confess, he's faithful and just to cleanse us. And there was a sense of cleansing, like, wow, everything's out in the light. There's nothing left in the dark. And I felt this sense of lightness. Sadly, though, I misinterpreted that feeling to mean that confession is the thing that will change my life. And that's just not true. I found, sadly, later on in hindsight, I would realize that confession alone doesn't actually change anything. It's important. It's essential. You can't get into the light without confessing. But confession is sort of like a door. And if there's this door here and everything on this side is all of the stuff that I've put in the dark, and the light is on this side, confession is merely like opening that door. It doesn't actually bring everything from the dark out into the light, but at least lets the light to expose the things that are in the dark. And so I had opened that door, but everything in the dark was still firmly planted in there. And I wouldn't learn until later that really the way that you get the stuff out of the dark into the light so that you can really experience healing and the fullness of what it means to walk in the light is that comes through brokenness and repentance. And that would be a while later for me, because less than a week after that first confession to my wife of all these things, I was in bed with another woman. And when I came home from that encounter, my wife had her bags packed and she says, I know where you were and I don't want to ever see you or speak to you ever again. And that was a wake-up call for me, because I had this delusional thought, or these delusional ideas that my wife would never leave me. Now that's crazy thinking. I mean, to think about all the ways that I was betraying her and just being a colossal jerk to live with and sinning against her in all these ways. And yet I was thinking she would never leave. And part of that was because I just believed she had faith enough for the both of us. I just felt like, man, she's a godly woman. She always takes the high road. Well, she did take the high road right out of town. She left. And it was the right decision because she was protecting herself from any more damage that I could do. Interestingly, though, God used that very day of my wife leaving as the catalyst for bringing me to my knees. And it was in that day that I went back into my house all alone. My wife left. And I had one of those moments that was so clear. It was just so clear that I had to make a decision in that moment. I couldn't put it off for another day. And the decision came down to two things. I could either keep doing what I was doing, which led to either death or prison. And I promise you, I would have been dead before another year had passed, because I really do believe what the Bible says in Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. And we don't like to interpret that literally a lot of times because it's painful. We want to think that's just something spiritual or emotional. But the reality is I was essentially working for my lust for years. And as I was working for that sin, the payment that I was receiving from it was death. It was killing my soul. And in many ways, it was about to kill my body too, because in the year prior to my wife leaving, I had sat on the end of my bed with a loaded gun in my hand, pointed at my head, safety off, trying to think of just one good reason not to pull the trigger. The wages of sin is death. But the other choice that I had to make when I was sitting on that couch all by myself was, I could return to the God who saved me when I was a 6-year-old boy. I was saved by God in my grandmother's house, actually, more specifically in her bathroom with my head 6 inches from a toilet. Now, that might not have any significance to any of you watching or listening, but for me, it eventually had a lot of significance because when I was in my grandmother's house, I was in the living room, and my dad and my grandfather were talking, and my grandfather was an evangelist. That was his spiritual gifting, and he just had this ability to just turn conversations so seamlessly towards spiritual matters. Well, my dad and my grandfather were talking, and guess what subject they were talking about? How can we make the gospel simpler to understand? Well, I can testify as a 6-year-old boy, it was simple enough for me to understand, and I could feel this quickening in my spirit, in my heart. And I was responding to the gospel that they were presenting there. And so I slipped down into the hallway and into the bathroom and shut the door, and I went down and I knelt down next to the toilet. And my head was 6 inches from the toilet bowl when I placed my faith in Jesus Christ as my only hope for being made right with God. And well, in that moment, I didn't understand any significance of where I was being saved. If you fast forward to me being all alone, my wife having just left, all this addiction in my life, and God brings to mind that he saved me next to the toilet bowl. The reason that had significance in my life then, as an adult man all by myself, was it was the first time in my life where I really experienced, almost in a visceral way, the reality that God is not bound by time like we are. He doesn't experience my life and your life the way we experience it, just in this linear fashion, one moment after the next. He'd already seen the end of my life from its beginning. And the reason I see the significance of that toilet is because he saved me next to the very thing that we flush our waste and our garbage and the stuff, the things we're trying to hide. He knew before I did all of these things, all of this waste, all this filth of sexual sin that I would bring into my life. And he wanted me to know that he knew before I did any of it, and he still chose me. And I get emotional every single time I think about it, because that is grace, that is love, that is mercy, that is so profound and rich, and it's found in Jesus Christ. And so the rest of that day was spent on my living room floor, just sobbing my eyes out. Real brokenness had overcome me. As it says in 2 Corinthians 10, there's a godly sorrow that produces repentance. And not my soul is heavy, my soul was sorrowful. And it began to produce a repentance in my life, a changing of mind, this realization that I was wrong, and I was living a lie, and I was pursuing things that were not right. And so from that day forward, that's been almost 18 years now, I have been on this journey of recovery and growth. And God has done some pretty miraculous things in my life, not the least of which is he reconciled my marriage. My wife and I, we were separated for 9 months, and in that time, God was restoring my soul, but he was also healing the heart of my wife and healing her and giving her a whole new perspective of forgiveness and trust and all these kinds of things. And so we were able to come back together. God has also graciously given me and my wife 3 children, and Haley, Ethan, and Megan. They're teenagers now, but I mean, every time I think of them, there's the word grace that comes to mind, because logically they shouldn't exist. But I love Psalm 103:10 that says, he, God, does not treat us as our sins deserve, nor repay us according to our iniquities. Lest there be anybody out there that thinks that grace is only a New Testament concept, the Old Testament is rich in God's grace and his steadfast love. And I was able to experience that in this redemptive process of recovery and growth and healing that occurred in my life. And what I always love to tell people who are out there that might be struggling all the way to a point even of a stronghold in pornography or some other kind of sexual sin is that God is not only able to free you from the bondage of the behaviors. The really cool thing is he's able to free you from the bondage of the lustful desires. And that's what's been really cool for me to see in my life, is the power of the gospel has not only set me free from the addictive behaviors, the acting out pornography and all the other kind of sexual sinful behaviors, but he has changed my heart to where I don't want the things that I used to want. Now, don't misinterpret that to mean that I'm never tempted. But I used to wake up as a Christian man. I used to wake up wanting to go look for pornography. It's like my desires had gotten all entangled so much into pornography and lust that I didn't have the firm foundation. I didn't have this foundation that I have now, that God has healed me and cleansed me from that. And so that's my story. And part of it too is then in 2003, God called me into full-time ministry. And so since 2003, we started Be Broken Ministries, and our whole mission is about connecting and growing the Christian pure sex community. So what we try to do is we network with ministries. We try to raise up leaders and people who are doing ministry like us in terms of trying to help people break free. Again, not only from the behaviors, but get a clear understanding of what God's word has to say about his design and purpose for our sexuality. Because we find in the church, there are a lot of Christians who are actually still ignorant regarding what the Bible has to say about sex and sexuality. And God has a lot to say about it. And so that's what our ministry is about. We have help for men, help for wives, couples, parents, teenagers. We've got all kinds of resources for people who are facing any kind of issue of sexual brokenness. But not only that, helping to promote and educate people and create a sense of awareness about how do we live more into this design and purpose that God has? And how do we deliver that message in a way, not only in the church, but in the culture, that we deliver it with grace and truth in the same way that Jesus was full of grace and truth? Because sometimes we've seen ministries kind of go too far in either direction, go so far in the sense of grace that there's this licentious attitude that says we're not really about helping you transform or address the real sin issues in your life. But then we have others that go too far to say, they can just have almost hateful messages regarding people's sin in their life and not bring the gospel with a sense of compassion and gratitude. So that's my story. I don't know if we want to maybe have any questions related to my story, or if we want to go ahead and get into talking about just laying out the design of God's view of sexuality.
Sure, we can pause there, and if anyone wants to ask a question pertaining to what we just heard, then there would be a time. You can submit it via hitting the Q&A button, or you can also type in a comment on the Facebook live stream, or you can click raise hand and ask a question that way as well. If there are no questions, we can just move on to the next phase, which is on God's design for sexuality. I'll give people a couple minutes, see if anyone has any questions. Someone did submit a question. I'm not sure how relevant it is to what you said, actually, but I'll read it anyway, and you can see what you think. This guy called Street Preachers is his alias. He says, a famous revivalist once said, in conviction of sin, it is usually one that causes the rest to fall like dominoes. At what point did your worldview or belief system become overwhelmingly challenged?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I totally understand the question in terms of, at what point did your worldview or belief system become overwhelmingly challenged? I mean, I think it was certainly overwhelmingly challenged the deeper I got into my addiction, because I think at every step, my worldview is being challenged, because I came from this environment growing up of having a Christian and biblical worldview, at least in a very basic general sense, even though I felt it was a strong Christian worldview. But every single step along the way, in terms of the pornography use and those kind of things, I was challenging that worldview, because I was getting more and more deceived into my sin. And so I feel like I've had challenges both directions in terms of my worldview. I started with a worldview that was Christian and Bible-based, and then my addiction was definitely challenging that. And I would say the dominoes were falling in that direction towards my sin and being deceived. And then as part of recovery, it's like there was an awakening or a reawakening then of my Christian worldview that then challenged all of those lies of the addictive or lustful worldview. And so that's really what my recovery was about. I think of it like a redeeming or a reawakening of that original worldview that I had.
Yeah. An anonymous viewer submitted a question. What advice would you give to someone who is in the midst of a pornographic addiction?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is that you will need at some level and in some way to share that and confess that to someone who is safe. And the reason I say that is because I have learned personally, and then I've also learned in our ministry in dealing with thousands of people who are struggling with pornography addictions or other kind of sexual addictions, that while God is absolutely willing and powerful to overcome any kind of addiction, what I have seen him do most often, though, when it comes to a pornography or a sexual addiction, is he releases that power in the context of community. And so therefore, I spent years privately, kind of in my closet, crying out to God, take this away from me, save me, get this out of me. And seemingly God was either silent or didn't care, at least from my perspective. But as soon as I stepped into the environment of authentic community and really seeking to confess and get into accountability and really kind of roll up my sleeves with others, that's when the real momentum of healing occurred. It's like God unleashed power in that context that he was not willing to, for whatever reason, he wasn't willing to. And we've seen that happen over and over again. So I would say for the person who's involved in a pornography addiction, you are going to need to confess to safe people. And a lot of times that can be a counselor, maybe a pastor, but it's not something that you're going to air on social media. It's not something you need to, go into the public community and try to air it out, but try to find some safe people.
An anonymous viewer asked, how does one overcome the supposed rush or comfort feeling that is produced when there is addiction for pornography? Also, how do you attempt to control these strong sexual desires when they are deep?
Okay, here I love that question because, and we're going to probably get into that a little bit when we start talking about design. Sexual desire is absolutely good and created by God. And so sometimes we have pitted this idea of hey, everything that's spiritual and good cannot include sexual desires, and everything that's pornographic and bad is the only place that sexual desire can be expressed. The reality is I would not say it's about trying to, I don't know if I would use the word control the strong sexual desires as much as I would use the word direct the strong sexual desires. And the reality is when you have that rush or that feeling, you have actually, especially if you've been using pornography, you are training your brain, not just your mind. And what I mean by that is there's a physiological, biological reality that's going on. Because the way that God's created our sexuality is when we are aroused, and especially when we have a sexual release, there are chemicals that are released in our brain. And pornography, if our brain is meant to function sexually kind of at this level of release, pornography exponentially takes it higher. So in other words, you're overloading your brain with those endorphins and dopamine and oxytocin, these drugs that are being released. And because the brain physiologically craves balance, when you overload one part of the brain, it's going to diminish another part of the brain. Well, guess what happens when the back part of your brain, which is where a lot of these sexual desires and chemicals are released, when the back part of your brain is lighting up, guess what part of your brain is not lighting up? The front part of your brain, your prefrontal cortex. Well, guess which part of your brain it allows you to have better reasoning and make better decisions and say no to urge? The front part of your brain. So you're actually exponentially making it harder for you to redirect those desires when you're looking at pornography, because you're lighting up that part of your brain that is dimming the part of your brain that actually you need in order to make those better decisions. The good news on the biological part is that our brains are malleable. They're plastic, basically, in a sense, so that you can bring that balance back. But it's going to take time, not only of abstaining from pornography use, but also then, as Philippians 4:8 tells us, to think about things that are true and right and noble and pure. As we pour that into our brain, then we are actually, as the Apostle Paul says, we're transformed by the renewing of our minds. And that's not just a mental thought thing. That's actually a very biological thing.
Good. For those that are interested, by the way, on the science of pornography addiction and the changes that it makes to the brain and physiology and so on, I'm linking in the chat window to an article I wrote a few years ago on that topic, which covers some of that stuff. An anonymous viewer says, what advice would you give in regards to someone who has watched pornography while they were unsaved, but has become a believer and turned away from it, but still has scars left over from that period?
Yeah, well, the first thing that pops into my mind is this reality that whether we are a believer or not, there is the reality of consequences that we face, the reaping and sowing principle. But I also couple that with what the Apostle Paul said when he was pleading with Jesus to take away the thorn in his flesh. And Jesus was saying, my grace is sufficient for you. So many of us, myself included, I bear scars in my life from the things that I have done. I cannot erase my memory. There are times that even to this day, I still face the consequences of that period of time, because memories will come up. I wish I didn't have to deal with any of those memories. I have scars from those days. But what God has shown me is that his healing is complete and that his grace is sufficient, so that when those temptations come up, or when those thoughts, or when the memories of those scars come up, I can rest in the sufficiency of his grace. And so I would just say to you, really allow yourself to be, if I can put it in these terms, comforted and embraced by the grace of God, that you are forgiven, that even though you bear those scars from that period of your life, that God is not angry with you. He has not set his heart against you. He is for you, and that he can carry you even when some of those scars, bleed, so to speak.
Right. There was a question submitted on Facebook. What's the most, this is by Matthew Cook, and what is the most common argument you hear from people who think porn is okay and not harmful, and how would you respond?
Yeah, one of the most common arguments that I've heard, I was in a debate some years ago on Nightline with ABC, and one of the couple of folks that we were debating against, they were trying to essentially equate human beings as having ultimately no difference from any other mammal in the animal kingdom. So therefore, putting us all on par with just basically animals. So therefore, this idea that says, listen, we're instinctually sexual, and so therefore when we have an urge and pornography meets it just the same way a person or anything else might meet it, then it's justifiable, because, hey, we're basically, sexuality is animalistic, if I can put it in those terms, not in a crude way, but just in kind of a naturalism framework. This idea we're just no different than the animals. And so the way I would address that is, I'd first acknowledge, if that's the argument that you're coming from, then we fundamentally have different worldviews, because I don't see the value of a human being as being on exactly the same level as the value of a chimpanzee. So therefore, in terms of this intrinsic nature that we have, there is a higher, if I can put it this way, consciousness that a human being has than any other mammal in the world. And therefore, if you think about it, if pornography is simply a way to engage any kind of sexual urge you have, well, why do we have laws that prevent people from just on a whim deciding they want to stab and kill their neighbor? I mean, something about human beings is saying, while lions can do that, there's something about human beings that we have a resistance. We have this ability to say, I may have an urge, but there's something about my consciousness and even my conscience that says there may be certain lines that are not good, not only from a Christian worldview, but just from a societal standpoint. And what we've recognized is now there's a whole lot more research that's being done that's showing linkage between pornography use and sex shops and violence and all these kinds of things, that it can't be ignored anymore just as a moral thing. There's actually scientific evidence that's showing linkages between pornography use and violence. 98, 97%, something like that, of death row inmates have admitted that there's a direct link between their violent crimes and their pornography use. I mean, there's a huge linkage there. And so we have to realize that while I am obviously going to be coming from a Christian worldview that does eventually bring in the moral aspect, we can also state that there's societal implications to simply saying, oh, porn is good. Because one in five, one of the top 5 reasons for divorce, so the breaking up of marriages in the United States, is because one partner is obsessively viewing pornography. So we're seeing a direct impact of pornography in terms of breaking up relationships.
Someone asked, I think he's talking about the physiological changes in the brain when you view pornography. Says, does the same thing not happen when you're actually having sex?
Great question. And physiologically, yes. So here's the thing. I always tell people the analogy that I use when it comes to sex and kind of what your brain is doing physiologically is I use the example of fire. Now, the elements of fire are basically the same in whatever context you put them in, right? But the context does make a difference for what the outcome is. So if I put fire into a stove, and in that context, there's a controlled aspect to it, there are boundaries around it, there's a whole lot of good things that can come. But fire is simply operating as fire operates, even within that context. If I take that same fire and I put it on your living room couch, fire is just operating the way fire operates, right? But the context absolutely then changes the outcome. And I believe that's what God is doing when he's saying, I've created marriage as this bond, this covenant between one man and one woman as the stove, so to speak, the context in which I want you to express that fire. But when you use it in that context, there are good, helpful, healthy things that can come out of that. But if you take that very same element and you put it outside of that context, it's going to have a very different result in terms of outcomes. And so what I say is, this is one of the reasons why husbands who are viewing pornography are finding it increasingly difficult to be sexual with their wives, because they are essentially taking all of those bonding elements that God has created even physiologically, and they're actually pointing them towards pornography, and they are bonding to pornography. So they can't then have the same kind of bond that they're meant to have with their wife. And so that's physiologically, yes, similar things are happening, but God intended this to be something that is relational. And so when you're essentially having this physiological response to a screen, even things that are going on physically that you're just observing, that's going to have a different outcome than the physiological response that's happening in that intercourse between a husband and a wife.
Mm-hmm. The same person who asked that also asked, what if I watch pornography created by my wife or husband? Is the fire still bad?
Well, I didn't say the fire was bad. The fire is just doing what fire does. What I'm saying is the context. And here's the thing. I believe the Bible says, let the marriage bed be undefiled. So there's this idea that says God has given a lot of latitude within the marriage union for expression of sexuality within that. I usually have a 4-pronged litmus test for whether or not sexual behaviors in marriage are good, if I could put it in those terms. And this is one of those moments where I would say, kind of like Paul is known to say, hey, you know what, this is for me, not the Lord, and then this is from the Lord, not me. So this is totally for me. I'm not saying this, it probably has some scriptural underpinnings, but this is just the way I've typically dealt with this. First, is the activity moral? Meaning, is it right? Is it within the boundaries that God has stated as far as sexual activity? The second thing, is it mutually agreeable? Because if you're saying you want to do one thing and your wife or your husband is saying they don't want to do that, that's not a good sexual activity to be involved in, because it's not building the relationship. The third thing, is it mutually pleasurable? I don't believe sex was ever intended to be something that's painful. I believe it's meant to be pleasurable. And then finally, is the activity building oneness? In other words, is it promoting the oneness, intimacy in the relationship? And I feel like when all those things are in place, man, whatever, then sexually between a husband and wife, those things I think are absolutely fine.
An anonymous viewer asks, would you agree with Josh McDowell that we should have conversations with our kids from a very young age about sexuality? And if so, how should one go about doing that, particularly with people in the age range of 5 through 8?
Yeah, that's a great question. I say actually from birth. And what I mean by that is have conversations about sexuality all the way from the time your kids are born. Because when your kids are, and what I mean by that is if you make your home a safe place to talk about sexual things with your kids, then they're not going to feel as threatened or scared or unprepared for dealing with things like pornography and other kinds of temptations that might come their way. So from a very young age, even with toddlers, you can start talking about body parts and the differences between girls and boys and all those kinds of things. In the age range of like 5 to 8, I think at that point you start dealing with the issue of modesty. Hey, why do we wear clothes, and what is that all about? And you can go all the way back to Adam and Eve in the garden, God clothing them, and this idea of nakedness. And while it is that our bodies are beautiful and good, because of sin, there is an appropriateness needed for covering our nakedness. And so I think that 5 to 8 range is a great time to start talking about modesty. And then once you hit about the 9 to 12 age range, depending on your kids and the environment they're in and those kinds of things, I think you do have to start talking about the issue of pornography and the internet and some of those kinds of things that are going on. And then, from there you continue to have conversations of going into talking about sex and all that kind of stuff. And there's the good news, there's lots of good resources that are out there on this kind of stuff for being able to help you deal with that. And some of that can actually be found through our peer community ministry.
Someone on Facebook asks, are you aware of the ministry of Matt Fradd? He wrote a good new book on pornography and the science behind it, i.e. how it hurts people. Did you ever study that subject?
I have not read that book. I just wrote down his name here. So what was the subject again?
It was on the science behind pornography, how it hurts people, and I think he's talking about the physiological changes.
Yeah, I've definitely read stuff. Dr. William Struthers and others who've written stuff on just kind of the brain chemistry and a lot of that kind of stuff. And even some of the folks that fight the new drug, they've got a lot of great research out there in terms of what pornography does to the brain and to relationships.
Yeah. Someone also asked on Facebook, pornography versus classical paintings and art. Any thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, that's always an interesting thing that comes up. The way I address that is I think, listen, if there's any sense that I am attempting to use material to arouse lust, then I clearly think that is wrong. Now, pornography, I think even scripturally, it's clearly a line that God makes. We are not to engage in pornography. Porneia is the word that's even used when it talks about looking lustfully at a woman, that kind of a thing. And so I clearly think pornography is wrong. When it comes to classical art and that kind of stuff, I don't know if I would even be the person to speak into that, because I just feel like, listen, if I'm trying to look at something that I'm going to use for lustful intent, then clearly that's pornography. And sometimes people would be amazed at what those types of images can be. Those might be fully clothed images, and yet still somebody's using them for lustful intent. So I take the definition even a little bit broader than most people might, because of the lustful intent aspect. Just because somebody's clothed doesn't mean that somebody can't use that as if it were pornography in terms of the lustful intent.
Do you think that there's a sense in which pornography destroys one's appetite even for normal pleasurable activities that people engage in on a daily basis, even healthy activities, because of the feel-good or pleasure chemicals that are released in the brain? And by overloading the brain with these pleasure chemicals, one ultimately reduces the body's natural ability to release them in normal life situations?
Absolutely. I believe when you think about, because the chemicals that are being released in your brain, especially when you think about the chemical of dopamine, that's strictly just a pleasure chemical. When they talk about the runner's high, people who run, that's the chemical being released. And so it's not merely associated with sex or intercourse or sexual release. There are these pleasure chemicals. So I do believe that what happens is when we have overstimulated, again, if we've overstimulated through one particular activity, the release of those chemicals, it actually does end up having a numbing effect. I know for me personally, it got to the point where even having sex was no longer really pleasurable. I mean, I'd just been so numbed out. The only thing that had any kind of pleasure to it was the sense of the possibility of the chase. But the event itself was hardly anything. The other thing too is they're seeing an exponential increase in impotency in men under the age of 35 that can be directly linked to pornography use. So that answers your question there. It's like we're literally, if I can put it in these terms, we're literally losing our potency, losing our power because of this overstimulation through pornography.
Right. And other chemicals that, of course, are released in the brain during sexual release include oxytocin and vasopressin, which are responsible for binding men to the object of their affection. And what's interesting is that studies involving prairie voles, I can send the references for this if anyone is interested, have indicated that following mating, females actually show a preference for their partner over a stranger, and so it increases the bonding affinity. Whereas whereas the partner's preference is actually destroyed in the mating female by infusion of an oxytocin receptor antagonist. So actually, extending that research a bit further, and I don't think the studies are conclusive as to whether pornography actually affects people in this way, but based upon this sort of research, I think that it's a very plausible inference that actually pornography destroys or significantly undermines one's ability to properly bond with one's spouse.
I totally agree with that. Yeah, and not only from inferences from research from like that, but from personal experience and from what we have heard from literally thousands of couples in our ministry, is that's the reality of what ends up occurring. Is this we've heard from many, many wives basically saying he absolutely loves his porn more than he loves me. There's just not a bond there.
Have you heard of the 1954 research by James Olds and Peter Milner on laboratory rats studying the neural networks in the brain, where basically they found that when they induced electric shocks in the septal area of the brain, it triggers the reward response, and the reward response of the brain brought the rat so much pleasure that when given the choice, the rodents actually chose the reward switch over the food, even in the worst case, obsessively flipping the reward switch at 5-second intervals. And so the rodents actually literally would rather starve themselves to death than let go of the deadly stimulus. So the rats were literally pleasuring themselves to death.
Well, if you think about this again, like I was saying earlier, when you're lighting up, so to speak, that pleasure center in your brain, and that means it's dimming sort of the reasoning center of your brain, you can see why men especially, women too, but men especially, will do incredibly stupid things when sexually aroused, right? I mean, we don't make good decisions if we're highly sexually stimulated. So it's like we're like those rats, push that button, and then we will, I mean, I've heard of guys that they've gone 3 days without food because they've been on a sexual binge. Well, it's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. There's also a really interesting piece in Augustine. St. Augustine was a famous sex addict who became a Christian about in the 8400s, and he has a really interesting section in his Confessions where he writes not concerning sexual stimuli in particular, but concerning violence, which I think can be applied to this case. He writes in his Confessions about a man named Alypius, which aptly I think illustrates this point, that actually often pornography or sexual addiction starts off with something very, very mild, as you said, such as just simply curiosity, which then leads to desensitization, and later it always pushes you beyond your limitations. So Augustine writes, and I quote, writing about Alypius, he, not relinquishing that worldly way which his parents had bewitched him to pursue, had gone before me to Rome to study law, and there he was carried away in an extraordinary manner with an incredible eagerness after the gladiatorial shows. For being utterly opposed to and detesting such spectacles, he was one day met by chance by various of his acquaintance and fellow students returning from dinner. and they with a friendly violence drew him, vehemently objecting and resisting, into the amphitheater on the day of these cruel and deadly shows, he thus protesting, though you drag my body to that place and there place me, can you force me to give my mind and lend my eyes to these shows? Thus shall I be absent while present, and so shall overcome both you and them. They, hearing this, dragged him on, nevertheless, desirous perchance to see whether he could do as he said. When they had arrived there, and had taken their places as they could, the whole place became excited with the inhuman sports. But he, shutting up the doors of his eyes, forbade his mind to roam abroad after such naughtiness, and would that he had shut his ears also, for upon the fall of one in the fight, a mighty cry from the whole audience stirring him strongly, he, overcome by curiosity, and prepared as it were to despise and rise superior to it, no matter what it were, opened his eyes, and was struck with a deeper wound in his soul than the other whom he desired to see was in his body. And he fell more miserably than he on whose fall that mighty clamour was raised, which entered through his ears and unlocked his eyes to make way for the striking and beating down of his soul, which was bold rather than valiant hitherto, and so much the weaker that it presumed on itself, which ought to have depended on you, God. For directly he saw that blood, he therewith imbibed a sort of savageness, nor did he turn away, but fixed his eye, drinking in madness unconsciously, and was delighted with the guilty contest, and drunken with the bloody pastime. Nor was he now the same he came in, but was one of the throng he came unto, and a true companion of those who had brought him there. Why need I say more? He looked, shouted, was excited, carried away with him the madness which would stimulate him to return, not only with those who first enticed him, but also before them yet, and to draw in others. And from all this did thou, God, with the most powerful and most merciful hand pluck him, and taught him not to repose confidence in himself but in you, but not till long after. So that's what Augustine had to say on that, where it starts something that's far milder, and starts off with curiosity and then gets larger and larger as one gets desensitized to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kind of has. I say it's a progressive degeneration, if I can put those terms together. It's like, it becomes. I know for me, it became something where it started out very, very small, and then it became the only thing that I could see. And so that's why I really feel like the way that transformation really happens for people who have gotten bound up in pornography or other kind of sexual sin is there has to be that breaking. There's got to be that brokenness. Because and that's why I put that together with the repentance, because I really don't think that I would have repented had I not first been broken. And that's one of the reasons we named our ministry Be Broken Ministries. It's like you can't get to that change of mind until your heart and your soul is really broken before God. It's kind of like when David made his confession in Psalm 51, and although he'd sinned against all these other people, he acknowledged that his sin first and foremost was against God and only God.
Mm-hmm. An anonymous viewer says, on average, how old are people initially when they start getting into pornography, and how can we introduce the issue of pornography to youth ministry? Let's assume majority or all of them are boys.
So the average age is usually somewhere between 9 to 11 years old that exposure to pornography first happens. In the United States especially, this is happening more and more through mobile devices, and a lot of times through kids simply just innocently doing homework, and then they type in some kind of search term that is misspelled. And by the way, pornographers know that, and they purposely target children with interposed letters in certain key, superhero characters or whatever else. They will do that because they know that first time exposure to pornography is around the ages of 9 to 11. First time that somebody is getting help for a pornography addiction is around 35 years old. So you're talking about a 25-year consumer if you're a pornographer. So I think the way you introduce it into a youth ministry or really any kind of ministry environment is I always lead with the vision. And too many times I see it happen where people who are trying to help folks in ministry, they lead with the problem. So they lead with the pornography, or they lead with, what is the presenting issue sexually in somebody's life or in somebody's ministry. And the problem with that is I have a little phrase that we use in our ministry all the time, and I say feet follow focus, meaning you're going to move in the direction of whatever you're focused on. So if I start with the focus of let's deal with pornography in our ministry, and I'm focused on pornography, I'm actually pulling everybody toward pornography. unintentionally, but that's what I'm doing. I'm focusing on that. Whereas if what we say is, what is God's good and holy design for sexuality? And what's the bigger vision of that? And just to put it very bluntly, I actually believe that God's design and purpose for sexuality is bearing his image and building his kingdom. And when I say that, a lot of people are like, what? How do you connect sexuality with, I can maybe get it in terms of bearing his image because he made us male and female. But how do you connect sexuality with building his kingdom? And I believe it has to do with the issue of both procreation, but also this mystery that Paul talked about the union of husband and wife and the union of Christ and his church. And he was making a very specific connection and saying this whole institution of marriage that God created for the full expression of sexuality, this full sexual expression in marriage, is exactly the same kind of intimacy that Christ is seeking with his church. So the physical picture that we have in marriage of sex is the spiritual picture we have of Christ and his church. And so I know that might seem like, well, what does that have to do with youth ministry? And I think we have to attach ourselves to a bigger vision, because unless we are attached to the bigger vision and how then sexuality serves and moves toward that bigger vision, I think we're always going to just be dealing with the symptoms. We're always just going to be dealing with the presenting issues, whether it be pornography or something else. And so I think we have got to, as a church, we have got to get people connected to the bigger vision, and that your sexuality is not just something off here to the side. It is central to that bearing of God's image and building his kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, John, if you wanted me to get into some of the points, the finer points of that, or what you wanted to do.
You mean the next part of the presentation?
Yeah, I didn't know if you wanted me to go into that now, or if you had a few more questions. Or
we'll take one more question, and then we'll go into that, if that's okay. An anonymous viewer also asked, I know that pornography is a profitable marketplace and there is plenty of politics factoring in this. How can we be promoting a rejection of pornographic sites and encouraging people to seek God rather than porn?
Yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with too many times, again, we often have a negative message because we're attacking the problems rather than promoting the vision, promoting the purpose. And so one of the things that I think we need to do is be less about trying to address every single possible issue that can go wrong with sexuality, and instead try to point people to the positive and good design that God has for it. Because I really do believe that when you start with the design, and if I can put it in these terms, holy sexuality, when you start with God's design of holy sexuality, then you can actually have a much better picture of where do all these, where do all these issues of brokenness then find their solution in that design. And so you're still able to address all the issues of brokenness in the culture and otherwise, because honestly, if you have somebody out there that's looking at pornography and they are not a Christ follower, they have no biblical paradigm from which they're living, then guess what? I'm not going to start the address of their pornography issue from my Christian worldview. I'm going to start first from let's talk about Jesus, and let's talk about that issue, because if I start with the pornography issue, we're already way off base, and we're probably just going to get into some behavioral modification things that don't have any real long-term, effect and implications for the person's life. So I don't know if that answered the question or not, but I think we have to start with the vision, and then all of those pieces of brokenness, you'll be able to better see how they connect.
Sure. So let's maybe move on to the next part of the presentation about design and sexuality. Just for those that are watching, Jonathan also has a handout on this, which I'm linking to in the chat, which you can download if you would like to follow along there as well. So do you want to take it away, Jonathan?
Sure. Yeah. So we've touched on a few of these already, but I wanted to just highlight them a little bit more specifically. So I have four points that I usually try to make when I'm talking about what is God's design for sexuality. And I want to make it very clear. I'm just a regular guy. I actually don't have any letters after my name, so I'm not Dr. Daugherty, or anything like that. I feel like all of my understanding has been born out of my personal journey and just my unquenchable passion for the Word of God. And so, I mean, I love apologetics. I love the idea that we've been charged to give a reason for what we believe. We're supposed to be able to be ready to give an answer. And so when it comes to this issue of God's design for sexuality, I believe there's four key aspects to that. I believe the first part is our sexuality is for bearing God's image, because we're told in Genesis 1:27 that God said, let us make man in our image. So it said, in the image of God he created them, or in the image of God he created him, in the image of God he created them, male and female. So the idea is there's this male and female aspect that God said from the very beginning is what his image would be born out in. And this is one of the ways I also believe that we are absolutely separated from every other thing in creation, animals and everything else. Because I think I'm going to share with you 5 things that I think are part of this image of God that we bear. And I think there's many, many more, but I want to share these 5. One is the image of God is personal. And so while God has spoken everything else into existence and created animals and all these other kinds of things, there is a personal connection that he has with us. We have this personal aspect of God that he has placed on us in terms of image. There's also reason. We have been given this ability to reason, and there's an intellect that we have that is different. There's an intellect that we have that is higher than instinct. And that's one of the biggest differences, I believe, between humans bearing the image of God and all of the other animals in creation is animals operate out of instinct. We have this intellect that is from God that allows us to transcend and even deny instinct, which is why I think we have this moral order that is recognized throughout all of the world, even by those who reject Jesus and reject God. There is still a moral order in the world, and I believe that has to do with this ability that we have to reason. I also think bearing God's image means there's a will. We have this ability to act. Now, animals act, right? But I don't think they're acting in the same way that we can make decisions. Our will is something, like I said, that can transcend just instinct. We can make a decision while at the same time we have an urge to go one way, we can make a decision to go the other way. And I find it odd that that can happen, at least to a large degree, throughout the rest of the animal kingdom. There's also this ability to be creative in bearing God's image. And then finally, there's a holiness. There's a set-apartness that God has placed on us, being those who bear his image. Now, why am I telling you this in relationship to sexuality? I mean, sexuality is for bearing God's image, but if you think about it, all of these aspects of his image can only be expressed through our sexuality. And what I mean by that is through our maleness or through our femaleness. In other words, we don't make a decision as an act of our will that's disconnected from the fact that we're male or female, even though it's not a sexual decision. In other words, another way that I can describe this is there is a masculine identity for how we might think and process the world, and there's a feminine identity for how we might think and process the world. And I believe that when God said he will make us in his image male and female, that he was saying the full expression of the bearing of his image is only found in the two combined, not in just male or just female. And we see this throughout Scripture. I mean, there's ways in which even Jesus expressed things through what we might even call a feminine expression. For when he said, "Oh, Israel, that I would gather you under my wings like a hen gathers her chicks." That's very motherly talk. And I'm not trying to be sacrilegious or anything, but I believe those are the kinds of things that we see the fullness of the expression of God's image in the masculine and the feminine. And so therefore, sexuality, we were made male and female as a way to express and bear God's image through these things of reason and will and personality and creativity and holiness. So that's one way in which I believe that we are, that's God's design for sexuality. Another part of his design for sexuality is the obvious. It's for procreation. I mean, sexuality, sex is the way that the species is continued. But sometimes we don't necessarily tie that always with the spiritual implications of that, or the God thinking behind that. We think, oh yeah, that we're just like the animals in that regard. But if you think of it from the idea of we are meant to bear God's image, and then he said, be fruitful and multiply. When he said, I'll make man in my image, male and female, he created them. Then it says that he blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply. And that's different from earlier in Genesis when he said to the animals to be fruitful and multiply, is because the animals don't bear his image. So the fruitfulness and the multiplication that's happening through humans is different than the fruitfulness and the multiplication that's happening through mere animals. Because the fruitfulness and the multiplication that's happening through us is meant to multiply the image of God on earth. And in that respect, you could see this procreation element of sexuality as a way that God wants to build his kingdom, expand his kingdom, more and more image bearers on the planet. But then also, the third aspect of God's design for sexuality is for building intimacy. And we see this in Genesis 2, when we get a little bit clearer picture, a little bit more detailed picture of what God was doing in terms of creating Adam and then bringing Eve as the suitable helper, or the helper who would fit Adam. And it's then that Adam, when he wakes up and he sees this beautiful woman, and he just kind of loses his mind and is saying, for this reason, a man shall, and notice he's looking at her, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. There is something about this oneness that God has said sexuality is part of that. But here's the interesting thing. When you look at the issue of procreation, so simply, sperm fertilizing an egg and a new life is created, and this issue of intimacy, but when you put them together, there's a Hebrew word that is used fairly often for this kind of an idea of the sexual union in a marriage, and it's the word yada. And it simply means to know. Now, it's used in a lot of different contexts, so it's not just used about sexuality. But I find it interesting that this is a word that's used fairly often and repeatedly about Adam knew his wife, or so-and-so knew his wife. And it's in that sexual connotation, but it goes deeper than that, because this is about an intimacy knowledge. This is about knowing someone. It's not simply about being sexual, because there's several other Hebrew words that can be used just for intercourse or just sexual behavior. And yet so often is the case when we're talking about this issue of a husband and a wife, this word yada is known. And it's also used of God knowing his people and his people knowing him. So one of the designs that God has for our sexuality is an intimacy building that's meant to happen within this marriage, that is intended to be a picture for us, even possibly a feeling for us, of what the kind of intimacy that God desires to have with his people, and that he wants his people to have with him, to yada him, to know him. And I know it can sort of make us feel a little uncomfortable, feel a little, squirm a little bit, to think, why would God use the same word for this sexual intimacy in marriage for the kind of intimacy that he wants to have with us? Well, if you think about it, there is not a deeper human expression of intimacy that we can experience other than sex. I mean, it is the deepest human expression, physical, emotional, spiritual, mental kind of union that two human beings can have. And so I think it's the perfect picture. And I know God knew this. God knew this is the perfect picture to show just the kind of depth of closeness, intimacy, pleasure, feelings that I want to be expressed between me and my people. And then finally, the last part of what I believe is God's design for sexuality is that God's design for sexuality is it's meant for proclaiming the gospel. In Ephesians 5, when we're given these instructions about husbands and wives, we're told that husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. But then Paul goes on to say, he uses the very phrase that we find in Genesis. Therefore, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And he says, this mystery is profound, but I say that it has to do with the church and Christ. So he's making a correlation here. He's saying, listen, this is not merely about a husband and a wife having sex. This has a gospel message. This is about Christ and his church and the kind of unity and oneness that Christ longs to have with his people. And so therefore, we are intended as Christians that even our sexuality be pointing people to the gospel, that it's not merely about a sexual act, but this incredible union and this covenant bond of one man with one woman in marriage, in that sexual union and in that covenant. That is an expression, that's a gospel expression. That is an expression to point people to Christ and his church. And so therefore, those are some of the key elements that I've seen in terms of what does it mean, what is God's design for sexuality? It's for bearing his image, it's for procreation, it's for building intimacy, and it's for proclaiming the gospel. So the bottom line then is that I believe that the design and purpose that God has made sexuality for is to bear his image and build his kingdom. And if you look at the four that I've pointed out there, if you look at the first and the third, bearing his image and building intimacy, those have a lot to do with that first part, bearing his image. I mean, building intimacy is really about bearing the image of God, not building our own image, but actually bearing his image. And then if you look at the second and the fourth one, for procreation and proclaiming the gospel, that's really about building the kingdom. And so this is a simple way to maybe break down what can be much more involved and deep theological issues in terms of sexuality and the gospel and all that. But I've tried to just lay them out here in a simple way to be able to maybe communicate that to others, hopefully invite other believers to really embrace this and realize there's a bigger vision to our sexuality than simply not doing sinful behaviors and saying, oh, listen, it's just this private act that we do in marriage. No, while it is a private act we do in marriage, it is connected to such a larger vision of what are we doing to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ through how we bear his image in our sexuality. So I believe this. I believe that every sexual decision we make is a spiritual decision. Now, I don't believe that every spiritual decision we make is a sexual decision, but I do believe that every sexual decision we make, what we choose to look at, what we choose to say, behaviors we choose to engage in sexually, every single one of those is not just a behavioral decision, it's a spiritual decision. And so I think we have this connection to the larger vision of bearing his image and building his kingdom. It makes us think about every decision we make regarding our sexuality. And so I'd love to get feedback. I'd love to hear questions. I'd love to hear whatever other input you might have in terms of saying, hey, these are other things that are part of the design that God has for sexuality. Because I won't pretend for a second that I have exhaustively or comprehensively, presented this issue.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was really great. Yeah, I think that's a major reason why pornography and prostitution and other related things ultimately cheapen and devalue sexuality, because sexuality as designed by God is something which is sacred. It's meant to be a sacred union between a man and his wife. And to take it that way and cheapen it is to rob it of its design and intent.
And that's one of the reasons why I believe the enemy is so intent on getting us entangled in sexual sin, because it's not simply about sex. It's about the image of God and the propagation of his kingdom, the expanding of his kingdom. And because I believe there's a direct link to those in terms of his image and his kingdom, it makes sense that the enemy would go right after that very thing. Because if he can tear apart marriages, what is he essentially doing to the watching world? He's tearing apart the image of God before the watching world. This image of Christ and his church.
Absolutely. And I mean, as you've said, the paradigm of sexual addiction and pornography is the self, me, my needs. It's about, how can I use this person to get pleasure for myself rather than, and which is the complete reverse of what a covenantal marital union should be about, which is about, how can I serve this other person? How can
Right.
I meet this other person's needs? Rather than, and with pornography, I mean, you watch an image and you're either you're either satisfied or you're not satisfied. If you're not satisfied, well, you just flick onto the next person. And if you are satisfied, there's going to come a point where you're no longer satisfied with that person because it doesn't get
Hmm.
you that high. And so then you're on to the next person. And that's really I mean, no woman can compete with an endless stream of constant novelty.
Hmm. And you know
Um,
what? That's why I always like to remind people when they're reading in Philippians, and when Paul is, we've so pulled out of context the "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me," and we make that like a power verse, when in fact it's a contentment verse. And what I've found is what you're talking about there is pornography and sexual sin and lust is always aiming to create a perpetual sense of discontent in our lives through our sexuality. And so if we can recognize this idea of we can find our satisfaction in Christ, we can find our satisfaction in healthy relationships, then we can see the lies of lust for what they are and realize this is trying to attack my contentment and get me to think that I don't have enough, or that my wife isn't enough, or that this pornography is going to satisfy.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, and this actually leads to a lot of sin, not just sexual sin, but one of the root causes of sin is that Satan deceives us into believing that God is not good, that God owes me something, that God has withheld from me something, and so we throw ourselves a pity party, and that
Mm-hmm.
ultimately leads to us, falling prey to temptation and sin.
Well, that's exactly what happened in the garden, isn't it?
Mhm.
Just create that little sense of doubt that God's withholding something from you. And then all of a
Mhm.
sudden, what was forbidden looks very tasty.
Yeah, absolutely. An anonymous viewer asks, how does someone make a positive case of the superiority of a biblical perspective of sexuality to sexual anarchy? This can be done both biblically and scientifically.
Yeah, I would say, the first thing that comes into my mind when I think about this is I don't know if it's as much about making an argument as it is about living the ethic. And what I mean by this is, I believe that the best apologetic that we have for the Christian ethic is how we manage our lives sexually. So, therefore, if you want to make a positive case of the superiority, so to speak, of the biblical perspective, then it means we must take seriously the call to obedience that we have been given in terms of let there not even be a hint of sexual immorality among God's people. So therefore, we need to take passages like Ephesians 5:3 seriously and say, Lord, examine me, you know, take me to the mirror and show me if there's anything in me that is a hint of sexual immorality, because I want to be able to express through my life, not just my words, but through my life, that positive sexual ethic that comes through your word. Now, that may sound like a cop out answer or whatever, but I really do believe that's what it's going to take. If we want to see a wave of real revival in terms of um, promoting and promoting sexual purity and God's design for our sexuality, it really does have to eventually get down on a personal level and say, well, I would love to see it happen all across the world. What am I doing about what I'm looking at and what I'm engaged in? And so make it a personal mission. And then little by little, the way God does that through multiplication is astounding. And that's
Mhm.
how a movement, I think, occurs in terms of being able to give that positive Christian perspective that says, wow, I've tried this over here and I'm seeing a real radical transformation
Mhm.
in this guy over here. What's different with him?
Mhm. And what's often, I think, fueling the sex industry as a whole, both pornography and prostitution and all the other things that are going on, human trafficking and so on, is the demand. and the demand ultimately starts at the root of pornography. That is, the basis, the baseline of this problem, that it's a consumer product, that it's driven by men, and ultimately, if we want to change the culture, we have to change the root, which ultimately is the heart of man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd seen a thing where I think it was Sweden. I'm not sure if it was Sweden or Switzerland. But one of those countries, they virtually effectively rid their country of prostitution. And the reason is because they no longer punished the prostitutes. They put the severe penalties on the Johns. So it was like, yeah, go to the demand. And so what ended up happening is that just pushed all of the prostitution out of their country. Was again by saying it's not most of the prostitutes are trafficked anyway, so they're not doing this of their free will, and so the law was against the guys buying the prostitutes rather than the ones selling themselves.
It's really taking advantage of vulnerable people.
Right.
I've heard that a lot of these people are illegal immigrants who they have nothing else that they can do, and so this is the one thing they have of value. And so it's basically taking advantage of people who are most vulnerable in society, which is rather sickening. Do we have any other questions? If anyone wants to submit a question, they can do so either on Zoom by hitting the Q&A button, or on Facebook, or they can also click raise hand if they want to come up on video as well. One thing that I've found interesting, Jonathan, is I wrote an article a few years ago on basically drawing an illustration from Greek mythology. The sirens. You've heard of the sirens, right? In Greek mythology, Greek poetry, such as Homer. And Homer is famous for his Iliad and also for his Odyssey. And in the Odyssey, that's basically after the battle at Troy to rescue our Helen of Troy. On the way back to Athens in Greece, Odysseus, who's one of the soldiers, and basically the story is about his travels back to Athens by ship. And when he leaves the home of the goddess Circe, Circe basically warns Odysseus about the sirens, and Circe says to Odysseus, and I quote directly from the book, next when the siren dwells, you plough the seas, their song is death and makes destruction please, unbless the men whom music wins to stay nigh the cursed shore and listen to the lay. No more that wretch shall view the joys of life, his blooming offspring or his beauteous wife, in verdant meads they sport, and wide around lie human bones that whiten all the ground. The ground polluted floats with human gore, and human carnage taints the dreadful shore. Fly swift the dangerous coast, let every ear be stopped against the song. 'Tis death to hear. Firm to the masts with chains thyself be bound, nor trust thy virtue to the enchanting sound. If mad with transport, freedom thou demand, for every fetter strained be added band to band. And so basically, the sirens were this mythological creature which were like beautiful maidens on this island that sang this hypnotic, enchanting music and allured the unsuspecting sailors into the water to swim ashore, and their ship would be dashed against the rocks, robbing them of their passage of escape. And the sirens were ultimately cannibals and would eat the sailors, and so they would meet a horrible end. As Circe says, the ground polluted floats with human gore, and human carnage taints the dreadful shore. And what Odysseus, when he's going past the island with the sirens, he actually orders his men to plug their ears with beeswax, which I take to be sort of typify how we should guard our senses from temptation, from the allure of the sirens' enchanting music. But Odysseus himself is curious to know what the sirens sound like. And so he actually asks to be tied to the mast to the mast and left bound, no matter how much he pleads and begs to be released. And he says, me alone, with fetters firmly bound, the gods allowed to hear the dangerous sound. Hear and obey, if freedom I demand, be every fetter strained, be added band to band. And then he hears the voice of the sirens crying out to him, and they say, O stay, O pride of Greece, Ulysses, stay. O cease thy course and listen to our lay. Blessed is the man ordained our voice to hear. The song instructs the soul and charms the ear. Approach, thy soul shall into raptures rise. Approach, and learn new wisdom from the wise. We know whatever the kings of mighty name achieved at Ilion in the field of fame, whatever beneath the sun's bright journey lies, O stay, and learn new wisdom from the wise. And so the sirens here in this story, which typify worldly temptation, promise to deliver the desires of one's heart. In the case of Odysseus, that's wisdom, but their message is deceptive. To cease his course and approach the sirens would mean certain death. He might enjoy the pleasure of their music for a short time, but their experience would be short-lived, and he would join the numerous other mariners whose bones littered the island. And so, in a like manner, I think there's a parallel here for temptation, which gives us the promise of pleasure and enjoyment, but rather, and while it promises to give the desires and longings of our hearts, that as the sirens promise Odysseus, thy soul shall into raptures rise, rather it brings us destruction and certain death. Mm-hmm. And notice also that the sirens actually call out to Odysseus in the story by name and promise to fulfill the fulfillment of a desire that's specific to him, which is wisdom. So likewise, the temptation is specific to the individual. So Satan knows our weaknesses, and he desires and wills to strike at precisely the point at which we are most vulnerable to falling. What's also interesting is that in before I talk about that, Proverbs, the book of Proverbs in chapter 9, verses 13 through 18, I think has a really great saying. It says, the woman folly is loud, she is seductive and knows nothing. She sits at the door of her house, she takes a seat on the highest place of the town, calling to those who pass by, who are going straight on their way. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. And to him who lacks sense, she says, stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But he doesn't know that the dead are there, and her guests are in the depths of Sheol, which I think is a great metaphor also for what we're discussing. But what's interesting is that in the Argonautica by Apollonius Rhodius, also known as Jason and the Argonauts, we read of Jason's encounter with the sirens. Jason had received warning from the centaur Chiron that Orpheus, who was a violinist, was needed in his travels, and so this is what we read in the Argonautica. It says, and soon they saw a fair island, Anthemosa, where the clear-voiced sirens, daughters of Archelaus, used to beguile with their sweet songs whoever cast anchor there and then destroy them. Them lovely Terpsichore, one of the muses, bare united with Archelaus, and once they tended Demeter's noble daughter still unwed, and sang to her in chorus. And at that time they were fashioned in part like birds and in part like maidens to behold, and ever on the watch from their place of prospect with its fair haven. Often from many had they taken away their sweet return, consuming them with wasting desire. And suddenly to the heroes too they sent forth them from their lips a lily-like voice. And then it says, and they were already about to cast from the ship the hawsers to the shore, had not Thracian Orpheus, son of Oeagrus, stringing in his hands his Bistonian lyre, which is a violin, rung forth the hasty snatch of a rippling melody, so that their ears might be filled with the sound of his twanging, and the lyre overcame the maiden's voice. And so here we see, Orpheus rescuing the sailors by filling their ears with a more melodious music than that of the sirens, thus drowning out their alluring hypnotic sound. And so in a much greater way, I think that we should have our ears and minds so saturated with the gospel and with the music of Christ and with scripture that it drowns out the allure of temptation. As Psalm 119:11 says, I have hidden your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you were telling the story about the sirens and everything, the first thing that did pop to my mind was that Proverbs passage. I was thinking that's exactly like what Solomon was instructing his sons in terms of that warning. And but as far as one of the things that we often teach in terms of how do you overcome this is it's not about trying to get really good at what we call white knuckling, or just, oh, I just need to resist. It's more, I like to think of it more in terms of, let's go on a purging mission. And so you have this stuff that has been consumed in your life, and so therefore it's kind of taking up residence. Or maybe you could say you've visited the island of the sirens, and so you've found yourself living in this environment. You've consumed these things, and so the journey out is not necessarily about let me try to figure out every possible temptation I could have and then just create a plan for all that. Instead, it's saying, again, what's true north? How do I get on that path, and how do I purge this? And so it's more of a journey of truth, purging lies, kind of like what you were saying. Hey, there's a more melodious sound, there's a more rich tone that will end up drowning out the song of the sirens.
Mm-hmm. And for anyone that's interested in my article on that topic, I just linked to it in the chat. Grant Klentzman asks, what is the appropriate response when people find out that someone in ministry is engaging in sexual immorality? Should the consequence of that be removal of that person from ministry? How much grace should be involved in this situation?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one we get pretty often. To me, a lot of what's going to determine those last questions, or the question about being removed from ministry, a lot of that has to do with the response of the individual. Is there true repentance? When we look at some of the ways that Paul handled immorality in the church at Corinth, there was a particular individual that says, listen, this guy is currently unrepentant. Hand him over to Satan. Let that be purged from him, so to speak, by allowing him to reach the final brokenness that he has. But the thing is that we don't find anywhere in the scriptures that talk about continuing to reject a repentant believer. So there is a point at which, for the sake of the body, for the sake of the health, we've got to say, if there's a cancer that's growing, if there has been, sin, well, there's a disciplinary action that we need to take. But that doesn't mean that if that person responds in repentance, that we continue to have a disciplinary action. With that being said, I do think that if this is a person, let's say they're in a leadership position, they're an elder, they're a pastor, something to that degree, I'm not necessarily saying that they could or should be put back into that same exact position. But what I see happen too often is we come quick with our discipline, and then what ends up happening is we continue to reject a repentant believer. And that is actually unscriptural. And I think I almost feel like there's some churches that need to be disciplined for how they've disciplined, because they may have started the discipline correctly in sense of saying, hey, we need to remove you out of this position for now because you've been living in immorality. And so therefore, here's a plan we have, this is what we need to do. But then when that person responds in repentance and they continue to essentially excommunicate him, then I'm thinking, well, now you're in sin. And so we have to be careful of how we do that. I would say this just in that remark about church polity and some of those types of things. I like to encourage churches to have both have a plan on both sides of the equation, meaning what is your current policy and plan for how you are dealing with sexual purity as a staff and as a congregation. In other words, before you ever get to a point where there is an issue, like there is an immoral act or something like that, what is your current, how are you managing accountability and sexual purity now? The other thing then is I think you also need to have a restoration plan in place, saying when we have an issue where we have to deal with a person that is dealing with immorality, they've got some kind of sin, then we need to have a plan that restores them. Again, not necessarily to a position, but restores them to the flock. And that's critical, I think, because too many times we're casting our wounded out and never letting them heal.
I've heard it said from several studies that the number or the percentage of men, even at conservative Christian, evangelical seminaries in America, who have a current struggle with pornography is as high as 90%. what do you think is the best way to deal with that problem in our culture? Because it seems that often this is a topic that's not being very frequently addressed really at all. So what do you think is the way forward to trying to stop this?
Well, you just said it. It's
Mm-hmm.
not even being talked about. So we have to start with saying, listen, if this is true, and I do believe it is, that this vast majority of our folks that are wanting, truly having a legitimate desire to serve God with their lives, are entangled in some kind of sexual sin, pornography, then we are doing a disservice to them and to the body of Christ moving forward if we just plow them through seminary without actually addressing and dealing with this issue. So I think on a very broad scale, we have got to start having not only more conversations about sexuality, but we need to be creating more safe environments for those who are struggling in the church to get the help that they need, not so we can, create just an exit door that says, get out of here because you're, but a place that says, no, where you need to struggle through this is within the body of Christ. And that's why I think so many people, their ministries are being ineffective. They're bailing out of ministry altogether because the only places where they might find any help is far away from the church. And that's sending the wrong message. It's like we have the hope of the gospel. We have the message of Jesus Christ. I mean, why would we send people away? This is exactly the context in which those conversations need to be had. Some of them are hard. Some of them are disciplinary conversations, but still, if we're a family, then it's inside the family that we need to have those conversations. Because the fact of the matter, again, to tie this back to the realization that God's design is also for proclaiming the gospel, is when we don't deal with our issues as a family, then the watching world looks and says, see, why would I want to be part of your family? You shoot your wounded. You toss out your lame. And if I've heard the gospel correctly, isn't those the exact kind of people that Jesus embraced? So why are you guys, so we're sending the wrong message when we say, hey, listen, if you deal with this type of sin, we'll help you. But if it's pornography or some kind of sexual sin or any of that, then we'll kick you to the curb. And so we're sending the wrong message. So we've got to create environments within the church that we can process that and help people heal and grow.
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone else wants to ask a question, you can do so. Just type in the Q&A, but click the Q&A button on top of your screen, or raise hand, or submit on Facebook. I was also thinking, Jonathan, about Proverbs 6, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and also Proverbs 7, where Solomon writes, my son, keep your father's command and forsake not your mother's teaching. Bind them on your heart always, tie them around your neck. When you walk, they will lead you. When you lie down, they will watch over you. And when you awake, they will talk with you. For the commandment is a lamp, and the teaching a light. And the reproofs of discipline are the way of life, to preserve you from the evil woman, from the smooth tongue of the adulteress. Do not despise her beauty. Do not desire her beauty in your heart, and do not let her capture you with her eyelashes. For the price of a prostitute is only a loaf of bread, but a married woman hunts down a precious life. And so that the point that's being made there is that a prostitute doesn't cost you very much in the long run, but a married woman costs you everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
It costs you your entire life, and that small amount that you pay for a prostitute could ultimately cost you everything that you've worked to build in your life. And then it goes on. How can a man carry fire next to his chest and his clothes not be burned, or can walk on hot coals and his feet not be scorched? And so there, basically what it's saying there is, don't play with this stuff, right? This is very, very dangerous. Don't even, flee from it. Don't go anywhere near this stuff. And then it says, so is he who goes into his neighbor's wife. None who touches her will go unpunished. These are strong words. And then it says, people do not despise a thief if he steals, to satisfy his appetite when he is hungry. But if he is caught, he will pay sevenfold. He will give all the goods of his house. He who commits adultery lacks sense. He who does it destroys himself. He will get wounds and dishonor, and his disgrace will not be wiped away. For jealousy makes a man furious, and he will not spare when he takes revenge. He will accept no recompense, no compensation. He will refuse though you multiply gifts. Now, what's interesting, what's going on here, is that basically, if a thief comes and steals something, well, of course, the thief can always pay back. You can pay sevenfold more, and the thief can ultimately be forgiven and the damage repaired. But if you take what is meant for your spouse and give it to someone else, namely the sexual intimacy, you can't repay that. There's nothing you can do to make up for that. So I think that's quite insightful on the part of Book of Proverbs there.
Absolutely. And what I would add to that is while we can be forgiven in terms of those misdeeds, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about you still bear the consequences. You still carry those scars. And so in that regard, you can't ever, it's not a one-to-one kind of a thing. It's like, if I take a material item, then I could give that material item back. But when you are sexual, it's not simply a material exchange. There is something on a much deeper level that's occurring, that when you are drawing from that person and they are drawing from you, it's not something that you can just go, I'll give that back. So you're right. There's a whole different quality of connection there and exchange than just a material exchange.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the next chapter, it goes on and says, my son, keep my words and treasure up my commandments with you. Keep my commandments and live. Keep my teaching as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call insight your intimate friend, to keep you from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words. For at the window of my house I have looked out through my lattice, and I have seen among the simple, I perceived among the youths a young man lacking sense, passing along the street near her corner, taking the road to her house in the twilight, in the evening, at the time of night and darkness. And behold, the woman meets him, dressed as a prostitute, wily of heart. She is loud and wayward. Her feet do not stay at home. Now in the street, now in the market, and at every corner she lies in wait. She seizes him and kisses him. And with bold face she says to him, I had to offer sacrifices, and today I have paid my vows. So now I have come out to meet you, to seek you eagerly, and I have found you. I have spread my couch with coverings, colored linens from Egyptian linen. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love till morning. Let us delight ourselves with love, for my husband is not at home. He has gone on a long journey. He took a bag of money with him. At full moon he will come home. With such a seductive speech she persuades him. With her smooth talk she compels him. All at once he follows her as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a stag is caught fast, till an arrow pierces its liver. As a bird rushes into a snare, he doesn't know that it will cost him his life. And it says, O now, O sons, listen to me and be attentive to the words of my mouth. Let not your heart turn aside to her ways, not stray into her path. For many a victim is she laid low, and all her slain are a mighty throng. Her house is the way to Sheol, going down to the chambers of death. Those are strong words.
It's a strong warning for sure, yeah.
Will McCarroll asks, I lead a high school senior class focused on college prep and apologetics. While we try to cover what responsible sexuality looks like, we don't have a lot of feedback. What is the scope of pornography problem with young people, and how should we address this issue? I sense this is larger than we think, and there is not much resource, knowledge, or curriculum to address this.
Yeah. Statistics we have in the U.S., so I'm not sure how necessarily where this person is from, is 9 out of 10 boys and about 6 to 7 out of 10 girls before the age of 18 have been exposed to pornography. So I'm no statistician, but that's majorities. The majority of our kids growing up are exposed to pornography. So it's no longer an issue of saying, hey, if you happen to come across this stuff, we are saturated. Pornography is everywhere. So what I do is whenever I'm dealing with young people, I just make the assumption, not only have they already seen pornography, they've probably seen it more than once. And that likely half of them are engaging in on a regular basis. So with that being said, I think it gets back to that idea of, since you are having conversations about this, you might want to start steering those conversations to getting interest on why is having healthy boundaries around your sexuality good? What are those healthy boundaries look like? And what are some of your specific next steps for being able to pursue healthier sexuality? The other thing too is, as far as information, knowledge, curriculum, those kind of things, I'm a huge follower of the Covenant Eyes blog. Covenant Eyes is a resource that allows for like online accountability software and things like that. But they've got one of the best blogs out there that keeps really relevant, practical information, and they update it regularly. Lots of great writers submit to Covenant Eyes blog. So everything from dealing with men, women, couples, parents, teens, all of that. So that might be a great place to just glean some information. They've also got quite a few good ebooks, like free ebooks on various topics. And that might help you in your class in terms of just some conversation starters and help you kind of guide the conversation.
An anonymous viewer asks, what do you say to someone who is struggling with pornography and states, assuming this is the case, that he has been praying for many years to be freed, but it seems God is not delivering him from pornography?
I don't say this flippantly, but I would literally look that guy in the eye and say, endure. Endure. And the reason is because I think so many times, and the reason I'm saying this is because I did this. I think so many times our prayers are conditioned with a particular outcome that we have in mind. So in other words, when we're really struggling with something, when we're carrying something, when we're bound by something, a lot of times when we're praying, we already have the outcome we want. God, here's what I want. I just don't want this in my life anymore. And while that on its face might be a good desire, we're not actually asking for what is God doing in us during this struggle. So in other words, the idea of enduring is saying, keep praying, keep enduring, keep seeking God, but also, what are you to continue to do? In other words, I don't think that because a person isn't getting the outcome that they want means that they are off the hook before God by continuing to sin in the same way. So it's not like we can say, hey, God, I prayed to you, 1,000 times, and because you didn't sort of super zap me and take all my sexual feelings away, and I keep looking at pornography, I mean, I guess it's kind of your fault that I keep looking at porn. That doesn't fly in the face of God. We still all stand before God responsible for every single decision we've ever made. I can guarantee you, me standing before Jesus at the judgment throne of Christ, a lot of stuff's going to get burned up in my life because of the way in which I was living. It will not be refined. It will not hold true as gold. It won't come through that way. So we can't stand before God and say, because I prayed all of this and apparently you didn't show up, I'm not held responsible for my sin. And I don't mean that to sound cruel or anything. We've got to be truthful with one another. And so I would say to that person, endure. But the other thing too is, what is this person doing to connect themselves into authentic community for accountability and that sharpening and that encouragement and help along the way too? Because it's one thing for me to, like I said before, hey, me by myself over in my closet praying, and God is actually whispering to me that I'm not hearing. I want you to go step into community, and then you will see my power unleashed in a way that you can't even imagine. But I'm too afraid or too prideful or whatever to go actually do that.
Do you think a lot of people who are in positions of Christian leadership or authority, such as pastors and elders who are struggling with pornography, have an even more difficult time being public because they are the person that everyone in their congregation and in the wider community perhaps look up to? And so if they don't have it all together, they're expected to have it all together.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think perhaps they have a harder time coming out publicly than, say, someone who's just, on the pew.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that I won't disagree that the ramifications are higher, all those kinds of things. But but I look at it this way: the principles of freedom and purity and accountability and all that don't change because you're in a certain position. The strategy, though, for how you might engage them can be different. So I still think, hey, a pastor still needs to confess his sin. He still needs accountability. He still needs these kind of relationships and community. It just might look different. Maybe he's going to have a little bit more willingness to do that if he, let's say, gets into a Skype counseling relationship with somebody that's not in his town. That's still a way for him to get the help that he needs, but maybe in a way that, you know, is not going to feel as threatening or as, the stakes aren't as high. Does that make sense? So but the principles are still the same. So it's not like somehow a pastor gets exempted from confession or accountability.
Absolutely,
Those are still absolutely necessary, but the way and the context in which he does that might be different. And that's why, there are ministries, there are counselors out there that do those kind of things. Understanding the confidentiality needs of a pastor might be to a different degree than just your average person.
Yeah. I think it's so important to always be the same person in both public and private, right?
Absolutely.
Always, when you're in private, always imagine that you are, being observed by the person you most admire in life. And what would you, if you're doing something that you would not want them to know about, then that's probably a good indicator that what you're doing is not the most healthy thing to be doing. I wrote on Facebook just last week about how it's so important to be for consistency, to have consistency in the Christian life between public and private personas. So I wrote that never assume that you are who other people say you are. People might praise and admire you, but they have no insight into your heart. They might speak well of your spirituality and maturity in the faith, but all they see is the person whom you present to them publicly as your ambassador. They do not see your private prayer life. A man may feign humility outwardly and even be esteemed for his humility, yet his heart be swollen with pride and self-adoration. A man may appear outwardly to have his eyes nailed to heaven, yet his heart be full of impurity and lust. Who are you, really? Putting on an outward facade under which you hide your plague sores is just as much deceit as propositioning falsehood. Be the real deal. So I think those are important principles for Christians to abide by.
Yeah, and what I would say to that is I always like to think of it as a continuum. I do believe that there is, if I could put it in these terms, just kind of this ideal of saying, listen, true integrity is being who you are wherever you are. So the idea is you're not a chameleon that tries to, judge the context and the environment and then shape yourself accordingly in the sense that I change who I am. Paul did talk about that in terms of if you're going to try to connect with the culture, you connect with wherever they're at. But that didn't change who he was. But I look at it this way. I say, we've got to start with people wherever they are on that continuum. And for some people, like a pastor, if I come into his office and I say, listen here, buddy, if you're looking at pornography, then we've got to get you to be the same guy in public that you are in private. And all this, he's going to kick me out to the curb and be like, you're crazy. So we have to take him where he's at and say, okay, listen, you've got obviously a lot of fear. There's this confidentiality issue. Your job may be online. Okay, let's start with where you're at in the hopes that we can move that person to a place where, listen, I got nothing to hide. There's, what you see is what you get. This is who I am.
An anonymous viewer asks, is it normal to feel anger and frustration when someone is addicted to pornography or engaging in sexual immorality? I remember when I was addicted to pornography, I was truly frustrated and angry because I knew what I was doing was wrong.
Yeah, that's a great question. And my answer is an emphatic yes. And the reason that I think it is right and appropriate and even normal, especially for a Christian, to feel that anger is because God actually instructs us in his word to be angry. And the reason is because there are certain things to be angry about. When we think about immorality, when we think about sin, when we think about injustice, we think about abuse and abortion and human trafficking, all these kinds of things. All these things are injustices. They're gross offenses against a holy God, right? So in that sense, there's a rightness or a righteousness to that anger. what we have to be careful of is when we are looking at our sin and we begin to have that feeling and we direct the anger appropriately at our sin, if we let it continue and to pass through that to where it becomes directed at ourselves, then I think we have a problem, because the wrath of God was poured out on Jesus Christ on the cross. And so therefore, when we have that what I call unrighteous anger towards ourselves, that is what we might call shame. And so I think there's a rightness to the anger toward our sin, in the same way that Paul addressed it. When he said, "Wretched man that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death?" He wasn't actually making a shame statement. He was actually declaring, man, I hate sin. I hate how this operates in my life. And then he said, "Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord." So he was having that same kind of indignation towards sin and the struggle that it caused, but he was not tossing himself out as unvaluable or worthless as a result of that sin. Does that make sense? I hope that answers the question of the idea of it's right to be angry towards sin, but be careful of then taking the enemy's whisperings that then say, and that's why you're a despicable piece of scum, because that's a falsehood.
Yeah, just for those that are wondering about the extent of the problem, I've just looked up some of the statistics, which incidentally I cite in my article I wrote that I linked to earlier from 2014. Jonathan, I'm not sure you might be aware of more recent studies, but a 2008 study of 813 college students from 6 different college campuses revealed that of young men aged between 18 and 26, a whopping 86% admitted to having viewed pornography in the past year, 48.4% admitted to viewing pornography on a weekly basis, 19.3% admitted to viewing pornography nearly every day, and among women of the same age range, 31% confessed to having viewed pornography in the last year, and 3.2% confessed to having viewed pornography on a weekly basis. What's particularly striking about this is that 67% of young men and 49% of young women believed that pornography use is acceptable, which of course means that many young men, 87% of whom are users, are actually viewing pornography even though they regard it as unacceptable practice. And what's interesting is that there's another study published in 2002 by Rick Warren's website of 1,351 pastors, and 54% of whom confessed that they had looked at online pornography within the past year, and 30% of those had visited within the last 30 days. And that's just the honest ones.
Right, sure.
So that's incredible.
And Covenant Eyes also has some pretty recent data, because they along with Josh McDowell had commissioned the Barna Research Group to do some research that just came out last year. So it's as recent as in the last year and a half, 2 years. But they've got some statistics on their website as well that are pretty informative.
Cool. And I just linked in the chat to my article again, which also, by the way, incidentally, links, it cites peer-reviewed scientific studies which talk about the physiological and scientific harms of pornography. An anonymous viewer asks, are people that have poor relationships with their parents or siblings more likely to succumb to the temptation of sexual addiction?
I'm not necessarily going to speak into the more or less likely, but that is typically a factor. And the reason I state it that way is because we're not just one-dimensional, meaning we're not just sexual, or we're not just emotional, or we're not just mental, or we're not just spiritual. We're this incredible composition of all of that together. And also, we're not just an individual. And what I mean by that is all of us have a family of origin context of some sort that we grew up in. So there's environmental factors in terms of these relationships. One of the ways that I illustrate to people that we are all unique in our sexual temptations, and so therefore it will show you that these factors that are outside of each of us are very instrumental in shaping our struggles, even our sexual struggles. Is if all of us right now, if we went to some community area, let's say we're in the United States and we go to a mall, and there's all these shops in the mall. We start at one end of the mall, and we're going to walk to the other end of the mall, and we have a piece of paper and a pen, and we're going to write down all the things that we see that are tempting. When we get to the other end of the mall, we're going to compare notes, and we'll find that there's probably a lot of overlap in the things that we felt were tempting. But I promise you, all of those lists will not be 100% the same. And the reason is because my past isn't the same as your past. My experiences aren't the same as yours. The sexual brokenness of others that was dumped into my life isn't the same as yours. My exposure to pornography, my sexual experiences, all those things are different. And so therefore, you take all those things together, and we realize that even our temptations can be shaped by our environment and by the things that have happened to us in our lives. So that being said, when you think about parents and siblings and all that, if that's been a highly stressful environment and you did the best you could in terms of coping with isolating and disconnecting, creating a fantasy world, whatever it might be, you realize that while we don't want to go back and say it was my brother's fault or it was my mother's fault for all the things that I might be doing now as an adult, we do say those had a factor in shaping a paradigm out of which you saw life or reacted to life or experienced life. And so we try to take more of a kind of a holistic view to the whole issue, temptation and recovery and growth and all those kinds of things, rather than just trying to make it all one-dimensional. Like, hey, it's just about let's just take a look at the behavior. Forget about your past. We're not going to worry about that. Let's look at the behavior. Problem with that is, man, everything about your past has an incredible shaping influence on how you even think and process life today. So that's why it's important that you do have part of your growth in moving towards a life of greater integrity is opening yourself up to healing from wounds from your past and not being closed to that idea that your history has no influence on your life today.
Mm-hmm. Are you ready to wrap up at that point, or
yeah, that'd be fine.
Sure. That's great. Well, thank you so much for coming on with us. It's been a real honor and really, really interesting to hear your story and also your wisdom and insights on this topic.
Well, it's been my privilege. Thank you, Jonathan, for having me.
Well, thank you. Take care. I'll send you the link to the recording when I've got it on YouTube.
That'd be great. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone. I'll see you guys next week.